Okay, hi everyone, welcome to Practical English. Today I'm sat down for the first time in one of my videos, and the reason for that is I'm at my computer and I'm going to be looking at a IELTS Writing Task 1 essay. So I've been meaning to do this for a little while actually, and what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be looking at an essay and I'm going to be making some changes and hopefully some improvements to that essay. So a little while ago, a student named Adayemi sent me a part 1 and a part 2 essay. Today I'm going to look at the part 1, and next week I'll put out a video looking at the part 2 IELTS writing essay. If you would like to have your essay featured on an episode like this, you can find some details in the description about how you can get that to me. Okay, so let's jump in. Okay, so this part 1 essay is about coffee and tea drinking habits in 5 Australian cities. The question says, summarise the information by selecting and reporting the main features and make comparisons where relevant. So I'm going to go through Adayemi's answer and then I will have a look at my answer as well. So Adayemi wrote, the graph gives information about the way people buy and drink fresh coffee, instant coffee, and those who went to a cafe to get coffee or tea in the last 4 weeks in 5 Australian cities: Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, Adelaide and Hobart. The buying and drinking habits are measured in percentages. Overall, it can be seen that in 3 major cities, Sydney, Melbourne and Hobart have the highest percentage of people who went to a cafe to get coffee or tea in the last month, while Brisbane and Adelaide have the lowest in those who bought fresh coffee. In terms of fresh coffee and instant coffee, it's noted that Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane and Hobart have the highest consumption compared with the number of those who visited cafes for coffee or tea. The consumption of instant coffee in Adelaide is the highest, with 50% compared to the other 2. What I wanted to do when looking at this essay is not really jump too much into the grammar. I want to take a bit of a broader look at the IELTS Part 1 writing. And there's a couple of things here I want to say. The first one is about being complex versus being complicated. And then the second one is going from broad ideas to narrow ideas in your IELTS Part 1, because that's kind of the structure you want to take. So the first thing is complex versus complicated, and these get mixed up a lot in IELTS writing. If something is complicated, that means that it's maybe quite difficult to understand. Whereas if something is complex, that means it's maybe hard to put together. Now, in the IELTS, we actually don't really want our sentences to be complicated. We only want them to be complex. So we might have sentences that show off how good we are at English because they're quite hard to put together, but that doesn't mean they need to be very long. And it doesn't really mean they need to have lots and lots of ideas thrown in there. And so when we make these sentences, we actually want them often to be quite easy for the examiner to understand. And so that's something that people often get mixed up about. So if we jump back into this essay here, we can see that some of these sentences are quite long. So this one here, the graph gives information about the way people buy and drink fresh coffee, instant coffee, and those who went to cafe to get coffee or tea in the last 4 weeks in 5 Australian cities: Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, Adelaide and Hobart. That's a really long sentence, and so you can tell even as I'm saying it, I feel a little bit out of breath getting all the way through that sentence. That's quite a long sentence. And then I think here as well, this is a paragraph and it looks about a normal length for a paragraph, but actually it's just made up of 2 quite long sentences. We don't necessarily want our sentences to be that long. So let's have a look at what I've done for my version of this introduction. This chart looks at coffee and tea consumption habits in 5 Australian cities, Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, Adelaide and Hobart. So I've just made this a little bit simpler and I've paraphrased this. I've just said coffee and tea consumption habits in 5 Australian cities. Coffee and tea consumption habits is much quicker and easier than saying about the way people buy and drink fresh coffee, instant coffee, and those who went to a cafe to get coffee or tea in the last 4 weeks. It contains the same ideas, and so I think it's equally complex, but it's much less complicated to read this bit of the answer here. And then I've split it up, so then I go on to say it gives information about the percentage of people who bought fresh coffee, instant coffee, and who went to a cafe for coffee or tea in the last month. The other thing I think is quite important for part 1 answers is this idea that you start off with a broad stuff, and then only after you've kind of introduced the main themes, you go into some of the specific little details at the end of your essay. So what I mean by this is, if we go back into this essay, we've started off talking about like quite specific details here. If we look at this chart and we try and look for some more broad themes, we might find something interesting. So if we look at these black bars to start with, we can notice that for every single city, this black bar is the smallest one. And the next thing we can see if we look at these grey bars is for each city, apart from Adelaide, the grey bar is the largest one. For my answer, what I've done is I've tried to focus on these kind of trends to start with, because this is a bit more broad. We don't jump straight into the specifics. So I've written here, for all of these cities, buying fresh coffee was the least popular option out of the three. So we can see that here. For all of these cities, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, buying fresh coffee was the least popular option. And we can see the bar is smallest for all of these. I've gone on to say, for every city except Adelaide, going to a cafe was the most popular activity. And so for these two sentences here, I've used a very common, very useful structure for IELTS Part 1 writing. So it's for, blah, 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 and then a comma, and then blah, blah, blah. So for, and then whichever thing you're describing, and then you give the description afterwards. After I've mentioned Adelaide here, I think it's a good idea to basically tell the examiner what was different in Adelaide. So I've said, however, in Adelaide, the consumption of instant coffee was the highest at 50%. For other cities, instant coffee was the second most popular option. So that's just basically describing what was different elsewhere. The last paragraph I've given is a little bit more specific. In the question, they ask you to make comparisons where relevant. And so the comparisons I've gone for here are where things are most popular and where things are least popular. So I've written, among all the cities, Melbourne had the highest percentage of cafe goers, with over 60% of people having been to a cafe in the last 4 weeks. Meanwhile, Adelaide had the fewest cafe goers, with fewer than 50% of people having been to a cafe in the last month. So if we go up here, we can see this grey bar is the biggest out of all of the bars, and then in Adelaide, the grey bar is the smallest out of all of the grey bars. And I kind of follow this pattern all the way through. So instant coffee was most popular in Hobart, with almost 55% of people having bought it in the last 4 weeks, while this number was lowest in Sydney at just over 45%. And so that one there is just looking at this hashed bar, which is about instant coffee. And then finally, Sydney had the greatest proportion of fresh coffee buyers, with almost 45% of people buying fresh coffee there. This proportion was lowest in Brisbane at less than 35%. And so to get that, I've just looked at these black bars. Which of these black bars is the biggest and which of them is the smallest? I hope that's useful for you, Adeyemi. I've tried to focus, I guess, more on the big ideas than on specific little bits of grammar in there. So like I said, the first thing I would say is try and remember this difference between complex and complicated. And so remember, short sentences can be quite good in your IELTS test. They don't all have to be really, really long. Try and keep them at a sensible length. And then the second thing I would say is when you're summarizing these charts, start off with the big details and then move on to the little details. Don't jump straight into the little details. If anyone else is watching this and they do want me to have a look at their essay, have a look in the description and I'll share some details about how to share your essays with me, and I hope I'll have a chance to look at your essay in the coming weeks.